The hum started at 2:47 a.m. on November 12, 1963, in a garage workshop outside San Antonio, Texas. Not the usual static wash of shortwave bands or the crackle of distant AM stations bleeding through the ionosphere. This was different. Rhythmic, deliberate. A pulse buried in the 4.7 MHz band that shouldn't have been there at all. James Holloway, 34 years old, civilian radio technician for Kelly Air Force Base by day and amateur radio enthusiast by night, sat motionless in front of his modified Hallicrafter's SX-111 receiver. The needle on his signal strength meter twitched in patterns too precise to be atmospheric. He'd been tracking propagation anomalies for 6 years. He knew what lightning sounded like. He knew what solar interference felt like. This was neither. He reached for his logbook, hands steady despite the adrenaline beginning to flood his system, and wrote, "Unidentified burst transmission, approx 200 Hz bandwidth, repeating interval 47 seconds, bearing estimated northeast, signal strength S7 to S9. What James Holloway had stumbled into was a numbers station transmission from a Soviet intelligence network operating on American soil. What he didn't know yet was that the men who sent that signal had already killed twice to protect it, and that his decision to investigate further would place him in a category the FBI called collateral discovery risk, a bureaucratic phrase meaning his life expectancy could now be measured in days. Here's the paradox that should have been impossible. In November 1963, the United States operated the most sophisticated signals intelligence apparatus ever constructed. The National Security Agency's listening posts ringed the Soviet Union. Strategic Air Command maintained continuous radio monitoring across every military frequency. The FBI's Counterintelligence Division had been hunting Soviet spy networks since 1945. And yet, a civilian hobbyist in a garage in Texas, using equipment he'd bought surplus for $200, had intercepted a transmission that the entire American intelligence community had missed for 11 months. On the morning of November 13th, in a briefing room at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., Special Agent Howard Peterson stood before a map of known Soviet intelligence operations in the continental United States. 23 active networks, 47 suspected dead drops, 81 persons under surveillance. The map represented 18 years of painstaking counterintelligence work, thousands of man-hours, millions of dollars in technical resources. When a junior analyst suggested that an amateur radio operator in Texas might have detected a transmission the Bureau had missed, Peterson's response was documented in the meeting minutes. "Gentlemen, we have direction-finding stations in 12 cities. We have cooperation agreements with NSA, CIA, and military intelligence. We monitor every frequency the Soviets are known to use. If there was a numbers station operating in the American Southwest, we would know about it. What we have here is an enthusiast who's mistaken atmospheric noise for espionage. File it and move on." The room had laughed, not cruel laughter, but the comfortable dismissal of professionals who knew their domain. The idea that a civilian with hobbyist equipment could detect what the FBI's Technical Services Division could not was on its face absurd. That laughter would be referenced in 3 separate congressional inquiries over the next decade, always in the same context, as evidence of institutional blindness so complete it bordered on criminal negligence. Before we go further into what James Holloway found and what it cost him, understand something about the invisible war being fought across the radio spectrum in 1963. This isn't a story about codes or ciphers. This is about the fundamental asymmetry between hunting and hiding, between systems designed to find everything and systems designed to be found by no one. And if you want to understand how intelligence failures happen, how good people die because bureaucracies can't imagine being wrong, stay with this. Because what happened in San Antonio in November 1963 is a template. It's been repeated in different forms, in different decades with different technologies, but always with the same core variables: arrogance, and invisibility. James Holloway didn't report his discovery to the FBI immediately. He was a methodical man, a technician by training and temperament. For 3 nights, he tracked the signal, refining his directional antenna, logging transmission times, measuring frequency drift, building a technical profile. The signal appeared at irregular intervals, sometimes twice in a night, sometimes not for 48 hours. But when it came, it followed a pattern. Each transmission lasted between 90 and 120 seconds. It began with a distinctive 5-tone preamble, followed by what sounded like random number groups read in a female voice speaking Spanish. Then silence. Then the cycle would repeat exactly once before the carrier wave cut off. On the 4th night, November 16th, Holloway made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He called the San Antonio field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and reported what he'd found. The agent who took the call was named Robert Vickers, a 7-year veteran of the Bureau, assigned to background checks and low-priority investigations. His report, filed at 11:35 p.m. that night, classified Holloway's call as possible crank, Gash, radio interference complaint, and recommended no action. The report sat in a filing cabinet for 6 days. What Vickers didn't know, what the FBI's San Antonio office didn't know, was that James Holloway had already done something far more dangerous than calling the authorities. He'd started triangulating the source. Using a technique called differential time of arrival analysis, measuring the microsecond differences in when a signal reached 2 separated antennas, Holloway had narrowed the transmission origin to a 15-square-mile area northeast of San Antonio. He'd marked the zone on a road map with a red pencil circle. Inside that circle were 3 towns, 2 ranch properties, and a decommissioned limestone quarry. On November 18th, he drove out to the area, not to investigate directly, but to see if he could get a stronger signal bearing. He parked his truck on a farm road, extended a portable antenna, and waited. The signal came through at 9:22 p.m., stronger than he'd ever recorded it. His equipment put the source within 2 miles. He could see lights from a ranch house to the northeast. He wrote down the address from a mailbox, Route 7, Box 34. He didn't approach the property. He went home, added the data to his log, and went to bed. The next morning, November 19th, Robert Vickers received a call from FBI headquarters in Washington. The call lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, Vickers pulled Holloway's report from the filing cabinet, read it again, and immediately requested a priority meeting with the special agent in charge of the San Antonio office. What had changed? The National Security Agency had detected the same signal, not from Texas, but from a listening post in West Germany that monitored Soviet communications. The NSA's analysis indicated the transmission was a numbers station, a one-way broadcast used to send encrypted instructions to deep cover agents. But the NSA's direction-finding equipment, designed to track signals originating in Eastern Europe, had placed the source somewhere in the Caribbean or Central America. The idea that it might be transmitting from inside the United States hadn't been considered, until a civilian radio technician in Texas called the FBI and gave them an address. The FBI's response was immediate and, in retrospect, catastrophically flawed. On November 21st, a 4-man surveillance team was dispatched to Route 7, Box 34. Their orders were to observe, photograph, and identify all persons entering or leaving the property. They were not to approach. They were not to make contact. They were to gather evidence for a warrant. The property was a working ranch, 40 acres, owned by a man named Miguel Salazar, a naturalized American citizen originally from Cuba. Salazar had purchased the property in 1959, paid cash, and lived there alone. He had no criminal record. He paid his taxes. He was, by every visible measure, unremarkable. The surveillance team set up observation posts at 2 locations with clear lines of sight to the ranch house. They used telephoto cameras and parabolic microphones. They logged vehicle traffic. They recorded license plates. For 3 days, they saw nothing unusual. Salazar left the property twice, both times to buy supplies in town. He spoke to no one. He received no visitors. On the 4th day, November 24th, the surveillance team reported a technical anomaly. At 3:15 p.m., every piece of electronic equipment they were using, cameras, recorders, radio transceivers, experienced simultaneous interference. A high-pitched tone, loud enough to be painful, that lasted approximately 20 seconds. When it stopped, their equipment functioned normally. The team leader, Special Agent Thomas Garrett, noted in his report, interference consistent with high-power RF transmission in close proximity. Possible radio equipment operating inside target residence. That night at 10:47 p.m., the numbers station transmitted again. The FBI team recorded it. The NSA confirmed reception, and for the first time, American intelligence had proof. The transmission was originating from inside the United States, from a ranch house outside San Antonio, from a property owned by a Cuban national who had entered the country 4 years earlier. The FBI requested an emergency warrant. It was granted at 6 a.m. on November 25th. The plan was to execute the warrant at dawn on November 26th, using a 12-man tactical team supported by technical specialists from the FBI's Counterintelligence Division. James Holloway was not informed of any of this. As far as the FBI was concerned, he'd served his purpose. He was a witness, potentially useful for trial testimony, but not part of the operational phase. Standard procedure was to maintain distance from civilian sources until their testimony was required. On the evening of November 25th, James Holloway received a phone call at his home. The caller identified himself as Agent Robert Vickers and asked if Holloway could come to the San Antonio field office the following morning to provide a formal statement about his radio intercepts. Holloway agreed. The appointment was set for 9:00 a.m. Holloway never made that appointment. At 11:30 p.m. on November 25th, a neighbor reported seeing flames coming from Holloway's garage workshop. By the time the fire department arrived, the structure was fully involved. The fire burned hot enough to melt aluminum. When firefighters finally controlled it, they found a body inside, burned beyond recognition. Dental records would later confirm it was James Holloway. The fire inspector's preliminary report listed the cause as accidental, electrical short circuit in radio equipment. The report noted that Holloway's workshop contained multiple high-voltage power supplies and aging wiring, consistent with a catastrophic electrical failure. The FBI's investigation reached a different conclusion. Accelerant residue was found in 3 locations. The electrical panel showed signs of tampering, and most damningly, Holloway's logbook, the detailed record of every transmission he'd intercepted, was missing. Everything else in the workshop had burned, but the fireproof safe where Holloway kept his logs had been opened, emptied, and left ajar. Robert Vickers had never called James Holloway. The phone call had come from someone else, someone who knew Holloway had contacted the FBI, someone who knew exactly what Holloway had discovered and where he'd recorded it. At dawn on November 26th, the FBI tactical team executed the warrant on Miguel Salazar's ranch. They found the house empty. Salazar was gone. In the basement, they found a radio transmission setup, a Collins 51J4 receiver, a custom-built transmitter capable of 500 watts output, a tape recorder loaded with a pre-recorded message in Spanish, and a timer mechanism that triggered broadcasts at programmed intervals. They also found a shortwave receiver tuned to FBI tactical frequencies, still warm. Salazar had been listening to the surveillance team's communications for 4 days. He'd known they were coming. And on the night of November 25th, after eliminating the one civilian who could testify to the technical details of his operation, he'd disappeared. The FBI launched a nationwide manhunt. Salazar's photograph was distributed to every field office, every border crossing, every airport. Tips came in from 17 states. None led anywhere. Miguel Salazar had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. 3 weeks later, the CIA reported that a man matching Salazar's description had been seen boarding a flight from Mexico City to Havana. The report was classified and never confirmed. The number station went silent. It never transmitted again. Now we come to the technical autopsy, the part where we dismantle the assumptions and look at what actually happened. Because the question everyone asked afterward was, how did a Soviet intelligence network operating on American soil remain undetected for 11 months? And how did a civilian with hobbyist equipment find it when the entire American intelligence apparatus could not? The answer lies in two variables, both invisible to the FBI until it was too late. Variable 1, frequency selection and transmission doctrine. The Soviet numbers station operated in the 4.7 MHz band, a frequency range the FBI and NSA considered low priority for domestic monitoring in 1963. Why? Because 4.7 MHz is in the middle of the shortwave spectrum, a range used primarily for international broadcasting and long-distance communication. American counterintelligence focused on two areas: very high frequencies used for local tactical communication and very low frequencies used for submarine communication. The middle range, the shortwave bands, were monitored for foreign broadcasts, but not systematically analyzed for domestic transmissions. The Soviets knew this. Their signals intelligence had mapped American monitoring priorities by analyzing which frequencies triggered the fastest response times. They'd identified a gap, frequencies that were monitored but not prioritized, ranges where a short, infrequent transmission could hide in the noise of international traffic. The transmission schedule was equally calculated. The numbers station broadcast at irregular intervals, never more than twice in 72 hours, never at the same time twice. This defeated pattern recognition systems that relied on regular schedules. To automated monitoring equipment, the transmissions looked like random propagation anomalies or brief interference from distant stations. But here's the crucial detail. The transmissions were optimized for reception by a single listener in a specific location. The power output, 500 watts, was far lower than typical international broadcasts, which used tens of thousands of watts. This kept the signal footprint small. It could be received clearly within a 100-mile radius, but beyond that, it degraded into noise. The FBI's direction-finding network was designed to track high-power transmissions across long distances. A low-power signal broadcasting for 90 seconds at irregular intervals simply didn't register as significant. It was below the threshold of what the system was built to detect. James Holloway found it because he wasn't looking for it. He was scanning the shortwave bands for propagation anomalies, listening to everything with no preconceptions about what was important. His equipment was less sophisticated than the FBI's, but his methodology was broader. He listened to frequencies the FBI ignored. He logged signals the FBI filtered out as noise. Variable 2. The surveillance paradox. When the FBI placed Miguel Salazar's ranch under surveillance, they followed standard doctrine: maintain distance, avoid detection, gather evidence passively. This doctrine was designed for criminal investigations where the subject was unaware of being watched. It assumed the target had no technical capability to detect surveillance. Salazar had exactly that capability. His shortwave receiver, tuned to FBI tactical frequencies, allowed him to monitor the surveillance team's communications in real time. He knew where they were positioned. He knew what equipment they were using. He knew when they planned to execute the warrant. This created a ghost effect. The FBI was watching Salazar, but Salazar was watching the FBI, and the FBI had no idea they were visible. Every move they made, every position they took, every communication they sent was transparent to the target. They were hunting a man who could see them perfectly while remaining invisible himself. The FBI's doctrine assumed information asymmetry in their favor. They had resources, technology, legal authority. Salazar had none of those things, but he had the one advantage that mattered. He knew he was being hunted, and they didn't know he knew. When Salazar realized the FBI had located his transmission site, he had two options: run immediately or eliminate the source of the discovery first. He chose the latter. James Holloway was the only person outside the FBI who could provide technical testimony about the transmissions, their frequency, timing, and characteristics. Without Holloway's logs and expertise, the FBI's case would rely entirely on their own surveillance, which Salazar had already compromised. The phone call to Holloway, impersonating Agent Vickers, was designed to confirm that Holloway would be available at a specific time and location. When Holloway agreed to the 9 a.m. meeting, Salazar knew he'd be home that evening. The fire was set sometime between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. after Holloway had gone to bed. The accelerant was placed to ensure total destruction of the workshop and its contents. The safe was opened, likely under duress, before Holloway was killed, and the logbooks removed. By the time the FBI executed their warrant 14 hours later, Salazar had a head start measured in hundreds of miles and a crime scene scrubbed of the one piece of evidence that could have corroborated the FBI's technical findings. The FBI's after-action report, declassified in 1998, contains a single paragraph that summarizes the failure. Subject demonstrated advanced counter-surveillance capability and operational security exceeding Bureau assumptions for a lone agent network. Subject's ability to monitor Bureau tactical communications represented a critical intelligence failure. Subject's elimination of civilian source prior to warrant execution demonstrated premeditation and awareness of investigative timeline. Recommend review of communications security protocols and reassessment of assumptions regarding technical sophistication of hostile intelligence operatives. Translated from bureaucratic language. We underestimated him. He was listening to us the entire time, and he killed a witness while we watched his house. Let's talk statistics, because numbers make abstract failures concrete. The FBI's Counterintelligence Division in 1963 employed approximately 1,200 agents. They had access to NSA signals, intelligence, CIA human intelligence, and military counterintelligence resources. They operated listening posts in 12 major cities. They monitored an estimated 40,000 hours of radio traffic per month. Miguel Salazar was one man, operating alone, using equipment that cost less than $3,000, transmitting for a cumulative total of approximately 30 hours over 11 months. Detection ratio: 1,200 agents and unlimited resources versus one man and a basement radio setup. Time to detection: 11 months. Method of detection: civilian hobbyist, not FBI. After Salazar disappeared, the FBI conducted a comprehensive review of known Soviet intelligence networks in the United States. They identified 17 other suspected numbers stations, all operating in similar frequency ranges, all using similar low-power, irregular scheduled transmission patterns. None had been detected by the FBI's monitoring network. All were identified through civilian reports or accidental discoveries. The review concluded that the FBI's signals intelligence doctrine had a systematic blind spot. It was optimized for detecting large, persistent, high-power transmissions, not small, intermittent, low-power signals. The Soviets had identified this blind spot and exploited it with precision. Casualty count from Salazar's network: 2 confirmed, 1 probable. The 2 confirmed were James Holloway and a woman named Rosa Delgado, found dead in her apartment in Houston 3 weeks before Holloway's death. Delgado had worked as a translator for a defense contractor. The FBI's investigation concluded she'd been Salazar's courier, receiving instructions via the numbers station and passing classified documents to a handler who was never identified. She'd been killed when she attempted to break contact with the network. The probable casualty was Agent Robert Vickers. 6 months after Salazar's disappearance, Vickers was killed in a single car accident on a rural highway outside San Antonio. The accident report listed the cause as driver error. Vickers had apparently fallen asleep at the wheel and struck a bridge abutment at high speed. But Vickers had been the agent who took Holloway's initial call, and his name appeared in Salazar's file as a potential security risk. The FBI investigated the accident as a possible homicide but found no evidence of foul play. 3 people dead. 1 Soviet agent escaped. 1 intelligence network dismantled, but only after it had completed its mission and exfiltrated its operator. The FBI considered this a failure. The Soviets considered it a success. Here's what the FBI learned, slowly and painfully over the decade that followed. Intelligence work is not about having the most resources or the best technology. It's about understanding what you're looking for and where to look. The FBI had built a system designed to catch big, obvious threats. The Soviets had built a system designed to hide in the gaps between what was monitored and what was ignored. The FBI assumed that a lone agent operating on American soil would be detectable because he'd have to communicate, and communication creates signals, and signals can be intercepted. They were right about the theory, but they were wrong about the practice because they'd built their detection systems around assumptions that the Soviets had already mapped and countered. The ghost effect, the ability to see your enemy while remaining invisible, is not a technological advantage. It's a doctrinal one. Salazar didn't have better equipment than the FBI. He had better information about what the FBI was doing. And in intelligence work, information asymmetry is the only advantage that matters. James Holloway found the signal because he wasn't constrained by doctrine. He didn't know what was important and what wasn't, so he listened to everything. He didn't filter out noise because he didn't know what noise was supposed to sound like. His ignorance was an advantage because it meant he had no blind spots. The FBI's expertise was a disadvantage because it created assumptions, and assumptions create blind spots, and blind spots are where the enemy hides. Now we return to that briefing room in Washington, D.C. on the morning of November 13, 1963. Special Agent Howard Peterson standing in front of a map, dismissing the idea that a civilian could detect what the Bureau had missed. The laughter of professionals who knew their domain. 13 days later, James Holloway was dead. Miguel Salazar was gone. And the map on the wall in that briefing room had a new pin: San Antonio, Texas. A network the FBI hadn't known existed, operating for 11 months, detected not by the Bureau's sophisticated monitoring systems, but by a radio repairman in a garage. The laughter stopped. It was replaced by silence, the kind of silence that follows a failure so complete that no one wants to be the first to speak. In the years that followed, the FBI restructured its signals intelligence doctrine. They expanded monitoring to cover the shortwave bands. They developed new detection algorithms for low-power, irregular transmissions. They implemented communications security protocols to prevent hostile monitoring of tactical frequencies. They trained agents to assume that any target might have technical capabilities beyond initial assessment. All of these changes came too late for James Holloway. The final report on the Salazar case contains a section titled Lessons Learned. It's 3 pages long. The first lesson is, do not dismiss civilian reports based on assumptions about technical capability. The second lesson is, assume the target is listening. The third lesson is, arrogance is a vulnerability. That third lesson wasn't in the original draft. It was added by hand, in the margin, by someone whose name was redacted. But the handwriting has been analyzed. It belongs to Howard Peterson, the agent who dismissed Holloway's discovery as atmospheric noise. Peterson retired from the FBI in 1972. He never spoke publicly about the Salazar case, but in a private letter to James Holloway's widow, written in 1975 and declassified in 2003, he wrote, "Your husband was right, and we were wrong. He saw what we couldn't see because he wasn't blinded by what we thought we knew. He paid for our failure with his life. I have carried that knowledge for 12 years. It has not become lighter. The letter was never sent. It was found in Peterson's desk after his death in 1981. Miguel Salazar was never captured. CIA reports place him in Cuba through the 1970s, working as a signals intelligence instructor for the DGI, Cuba's intelligence service. He reportedly trained operatives in counter-surveillance techniques and low-signature communication methods. He died in Havana in 1989, 2 years before the Soviet Union collapsed. The numbers station he operated was one of dozens the Soviets ran during the Cold War. Most were never detected. Those that were found were usually discovered the same way Salazar's was, by accident, by civilians, by people who weren't supposed to be listening. The FBI's systematic blind spot, the gap between what they monitored and what they ignored, existed because intelligence agencies build systems based on known threats. They optimize for what they've seen before. They filter out noise to focus on signal. And in doing so, they create the exact vulnerabilities that sophisticated adversaries exploit. The Soviets understood this. They didn't try to overpower American signals intelligence. They studied it, mapped its priorities, identified its assumptions, and then designed their operations to hide in the gaps. Low power instead of high power, irregular schedules instead of regular ones, frequencies that were monitored but not prioritized, transmission durations too short to trigger automated alerts. It worked. For 11 months, Salazar broadcast instructions to an agent network operating inside the United States, and the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in the world never noticed. A civilian with a hobby radio setup noticed in 3 days. That's not a story about technology, it's a story about assumptions. The FBI assumed that important signals would be loud, regular, and on frequencies they considered high priority. Salazar's signal was quiet, irregular, and on a frequency they considered low priority. The FBI's assumptions created a blind spot. Salazar's signal hid in that blind spot, and when someone without those assumptions looked, they saw it immediately. James Holloway didn't have training in signals intelligence. He didn't have access to classified threat assessments. He didn't know what frequencies the Soviets were supposed to use. He just listened, logged what he heard, and reported what seemed unusual. That methodical, assumption-free approach, the approach of a technician, not a spy hunter, was exactly what the FBI's system couldn't replicate. Because the FBI's system was built on expertise, and expertise creates frameworks, and frameworks create blind spots. Holloway died because he found something he wasn't supposed to find, and because the people who were supposed to protect him didn't take him seriously until it was too late. He died because institutional arrogance is a vulnerability, and because the Soviets were better at exploiting that vulnerability than the FBI was at defending against it. The hum that started at 2:47 a.m. on November 12, 1963, in a garage workshop outside San Antonio, was the sound of a system failing. Not a radio system, a human system. A system that assumed it knew what threats looked like, where they'd appear, and how they'd behave. That assumption killed James Holloway. It let Miguel Salazar escape. And it taught the FBI a lesson they should have already known. The enemy you can't see is the one who studied you closely enough to know exactly where you're not looking. In the end, the ghost effect wasn't about technology or tradecraft, it was about information. Salazar knew what the FBI was doing. The FBI didn't know what Salazar was doing. That asymmetry, that one-way mirror, was the only advantage that mattered. And the man who broke that mirror, who made the invisible visible, paid for it with his life. The number station is silent now. The frequencies are monitored. The blind spots have been mapped. But somewhere, in some basement, in some city, someone is broadcasting a signal that no one is listening for, on a frequency no one is watching, at a time no one expects. And the only question that matters is, who will find it first? The people who are supposed to be listening, or the people who aren't supposed to be there at all? That question has never been answered. It's still being asked every day in every intelligence agency in the world. Because the lesson of James Holloway and Miguel Salazar isn't about the Cold War. It's about the permanent tension between systems and individuals, between doctrine and discovery, between what we think we know and what we've failed to imagine. The hum is always there, somewhere, waiting for someone to notice. The only question is whether they'll survive the discovery.